one of my goals with the book was that it's like, I'm going to clear up all these misconceptions about dopamine. I'm going to provide one chapter that's like, folks, here's what dopamine is. And so I don't have a final answer what dopamine is. I can say what it isn't, which is it's not a pleasure chemical. It's not, and that was a theory initially back in the late 70s, early 80s. And when you eat good food or do other pleasurable things that I won't enumerate, you're getting a hit of dopamine. But a useful way of thinking about dopamine in this context is that it's a marker of prediction error. So you don't get a hit of dopamine when something is good. You get a hit of dopamine when something is better than you expected. You can think about it in the context of like drugs. Let's say you take a drug for the first time and you get this feeling and it's like, wow, that was better than I expected. The dopamine is your brain's like bookmark of saying, do this again because it's better than you thought it was going to be. Now, once you've taken that drug 10 times, you take it for the 11th time, and it's no longer better than you expect. You know exactly what to expect. And so you no longer get a hit of dopamine. And that leaves you thinking, oh man, I want that dopamine hit. So you need to take a bigger dose or you need to take a different drug or whatever. And so that creates a cycle of wanting more and more. And you can see how then that kind of, the reason we end up talking a lot about dopamine now in the context of social media and it's kind of surprising us, but we always need to be surprised more. Like you can't just do the same thing over. So we need this endless scroll of just scrolling through it.
So it has been 6 years since we spoke last when you were the Endure guy, and Endure was the Bible for lay people for endurance. Now you've switched, you've decided to explore the topic of why people explore things. It's sort of this meta journey. What's been going on there?
Yeah, it's like you said, I was the Endure guy. My book Endure came out in 2018 and, it did well, which was great. I was super happy. And it kind of was, in some ways, it's like, that's what I've been working towards for 10 years, or define it a different way for kind of lifetime as a first an endurance athlete, then a journalist. It's like to have the privilege to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to write about and talk about this topic that I'm passionate about. By around the time we talked 6 years ago, I was starting to feel kind of itchy feet and feeling like, well, okay, I got here, but I can't just sort of stand here in the same spot for the next, 20 years and then shuffle off into the retirement home. I want to be learning new things and exploring different things. And this was a kind of let's say a somewhat unwelcome feeling. Like I'd worked very hard to be the Endure guy. And I was like, well, why do I not want to be the Endure guy? And that got, so I did a lot of soul searching about that and thought a little bit about other aspects of my life, what my career path has been, the way I like to go on holidays, like what when I go on vacations, I like to go new places. And in some contexts, I like to try new foods and, like there's this pull of always wanting to be, checking out the unknown and, so mix that all together into a potent stew. And I was like, I don't really understand what's going on here, but I'd like to. And so maybe that should be my next book. Maybe that should be my project, is try to understand what the draw of the unknown is, and whether it's a good draw, whether it leads us to good things, or whether it's a bad draw, whether it leads us to sort of give up comfortable, places where we should be and venture off into the jungle again. And so that ended up being a sort of, let's say, a 5-year journey that culminated in the new book.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about how you found the courage to make that jump at some point. But first, let's kind of break down this exploration gene, this explorer's gene thing. So there's this idea of DRD4. What's that? What really makes this whole exploration thing?
Yeah. So the title of my book is The Explorer's Gene, and I had some misgivings about that because I don't want to make it sound like some people are born to explore and some people are not. And it's just a question of whether you have the gene. But I was fascinated by this. There's a strand of research that goes back about 25 years now that found that there's a specific gene that affects a specific dopamine receptor that can make it either more or less sensitive to the rewards of novelty, of being surprised by something new. And so some people have variants that make them more responsive to that. And that gene is also associated with ADHD, for example. So it's not just about, wanting to go to the North Pole. It's about how we respond to, about how satisfied we are with the status quo, or how we respond to the idea of new things. And so to me, that was maybe the first step on a pathway of understanding that, all else being equal, in some ways we are drawn to new experiences. And I would emphasize, all of us have a DRD4 gene. All of us are drawn to new experiences. For some of us, that pull is stronger than others. And, we can all think about people in our lives where we're like, that person definitely has the stronger version, or that person doesn't. But to me, the message is more that, there's wiring that rewards us for choosing a path that's where the goal is unknown, that draws us towards uncertainty, and to, not that we like being uncertain, but we like resolving uncertainty. We like finding out what's behind that doorway.
Mm-hmm. And just to go a little further on this, so it's kind of genetics week on my show. Having Robert Plomin on in a couple of days, so I think people will understand that to say that it's one gene might be that's specific to things like some certain diseases and things like that. There, it's one gene, but often things are multifactorial. So this explorer's gene, maybe you have some change in your DRD4, but also then there would be other things like personality traits and such that would play in as well.
Very few things can be explained by a single gene. And, the classic example is like height. We know height is genetic, right? Like if you have tall parents, you're likely to be tall. What's the gene that does that? Well, I think the last time I checked, there were 2,700 genes that had been associated with height. So each of those genes has a small effect on height. And there are a very small number of like single gene disease things or things like that. Most things are very complex, and exploration is definitely one of those things. So we know about the DRD4 gene. There's some smatterings of findings in the literature of other genes that may be associated with novelty seeking. There's almost certainly a whole bunch that we don't know about. And what's really important too is understanding that the context and environment and all, our experiences all play a role in this. And so, when I would tell people, hey, I'm working on a book about exploring, there are lots of people who would say, oh, that sounds really interesting. And they were just being polite when they said that, obviously, because the next thing they would say is, but I'm not an explorer. I don't like exploring. And, people can like whatever they want, but I think in a lot of cases, what they meant by that is, I don't want to, hike to the South Pole in a blizzard. And that, I'm with you. I don't either. There's a lot of different ways of exploring. There's a lot of different ways of expressing the interest in novelty, and the ways that you personally choose to express that will depend on, how you were brought up, what the context was, and what's going on in your life. So some people might have been brought up in a very musical household, let's say, and so they are constantly searching for new sounds, new types of music. They're insatiable in the search for new music. And even as life goes on, it's like, I had kids in 2014 and 2016, and I can say, actually, there were periods, as well, my kids were young, and they're still pretty young, but certainly when they were very young, I actually felt less exploratory in other parts of my life. I noticed that I was listening, like in my musical taste, I was like, I just want to listen to the tunes that I really liked when I was 17 or 18. Mm-hmm. I don't have any bandwidth left because I was getting all the exploration I could get from my kids. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, it's not like you like to explore or you don't. It's like, in a given context, given your life history, are you drawn to try something new, or do you want to just stick with what you're familiar with? And we all have contexts where we prefer one and when we prefer the other. And it's I think we need to have so some people are at an extreme. Like some people, they just always need new things in every domain of their lives. But most of us have a more complex mix where it's like, I like to explore in this respect, but not in that.
Yeah. You're making me think of a friend of mine who absolutely does love to explore everything, and novelty is her joy. She was also just diagnosed with ADHD. There's these trade-offs too.
There you go. And this is, this is a topic which we could go down a very long and deep rabbit hole on, but what we call ADHD now, you could argue that those are very functional traits for hunter-gatherers. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we mentioned this DRD4 gene. Some scientists studied a group in northern Kenya called the Arial, who were traditionally nomadic hunter-gatherers, but some of whom have settled down into stable agricultural life. And what they found is that the people who had the sort of explorer's version of the DRD4 gene, if they were hunter-gatherers, they were the explorer's version of the gene corresponded to them being more successful. They were better nourished. They had more muscle mass. Whereas for the agriculturalists, those who had the explorer's gene tended to be less well nourished, less muscle mass, less successful. So the same traits, the same genetic kind of inclinations were really helpful for hunter-gatherers and really not helpful for farmers. And so, as we, I sit here in a city of 4 million, when we go to school, we have certain expectations about what you're supposed to be like when you go to school and all that. Well, there's probably a little bit of a mismatch. And so, we call it ADHD. It's really just on this, maybe people farther out on the spectrum of, I don't know. ADHD is complicated. I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in that, but a lot of behaviors that we associate with ADHD might be not useful in the context of grade 11 chemistry, but very useful in the context of hunting. And sorry, not to ramble on and on, but it's like there's good reason to think that there's a reason that those traits haven't died out, but there's a reason that those traits haven't taken over to be present in everybody, that as a society, it's useful to have some people who are at the farther end of the distribution and really pushing the boundaries, and some people who are more comfortable keeping the home fires burning and creating some stability and some institutional memory and stuff. So all these roles are important in the context of society. And so there's not a right or a wrong way of being.
Mm-hmm. And we're laying the groundwork here, I think. We've talked maybe briefly about the dopamine system. What does dopamine have to do with this? What do you think people should know about dopamine? There's so many misunderstandings about dopamine.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say that people should understand about dopamine is it's super complicated. And one of my goals with the book was that I'm going to clear up all these misconceptions about dopamine. I'm going to provide one chapter that's like, folks, here's what dopamine is. And, after like a year of treading water, it's like, okay, dopamine's too complicated. Scientists don't agree what dopamine is. Like there is no, so I don't have a final answer what dopamine is. I can say what it isn't, which is it's not a pleasure chemical. It's not, and that was a theory initially back in the late 70s, early 80s, that dopamine was, when you do something, when you eat good food or do other pleasurable things that I won't enumerate, you're getting a hit of dopamine. There are a bunch of ways of considering dopamine, but I think, and dopamine plays a bunch of different roles in the brain. But part of the reason it's complicated to explain is that it is a complicated system. But a useful way of thinking about dopamine in this context is that it's a marker of prediction error. So you don't get a hit of dopamine when something is good. You get a hit of dopamine when something is better than you expected. And this is really an important point. And so you can think about it in the context of like drugs. Let's say you take a drug for the first time and you get this feeling and it's like, wow, that was better than I expected. The dopamine is your brain's like bookmark of saying, do this again because it's better than you thought it was going to be. Now, once you've taken that drug 10 times, you take it for the 11th time, and it's no longer better than you expect. You know exactly what to expect. And so you no longer get a hit of dopamine. And that leaves you thinking, oh man, I want that dopamine hit. So you need to take a bigger dose or you need to take a different drug or whatever. And so that creates a cycle of wanting more and more. And you can see how then that kind of, the reason we end up talking a lot about dopamine now in the context of social media and screen time, it's like, oh, it's kind of surprising us, but we always need to be surprised more. Like you can't just do the same thing over. So we need this endless scroll of just scrolling through it. In the context of exploration, what this picture tells us is that, so prediction error is kind of what we're craving. And that is another way of saying that we're motivated to take the path less traveled, because if you're choosing between two paths, and one of them you know what's down that path, and the other one you don't know, you're not going to get any prediction error following the path where you already know what's down that path. The way to give yourself a chance of this better than expected outcome is to go down the path where you don't know what to expect. And so in that sense, where dopamine helps predispose us to want to try things where there's uncertainty, where we don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate your nuanced and maybe cautious take on this stuff. That's one thing that you really stand out in your science writing about, and I commend you for that.
Well, thanks. And I feel bad because I wish I could offer clearer answers. But
there are plenty of people in the world right now who will already tell people very specific things about dopamine, whether they're true or not. And I appreciate what you bring.
That's or what I don't bring, let's say, which is the answers. But thank you. I appreciate that.
Maybe. So with this human response, we seek dopamine, yes, and we don't like to just be confined and not have a chance, right? There's this idea of a dark room problem. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So to say that we're seeking dopamine is not really a good answer for why we explore, right? Because then it's like, well, why are we wired that way? And so there's kind of levels upon levels upon levels, and you can go down. So, well, why are we wired that way? Well, evolution wired us that way. And why did evolution wire us that way? And if you go down far enough, what you end up with is an idea in neuroscience that's called the free energy principle, which is really, I would say it's the dominant view in neuroscience these days, which is that another term for it is predictive processing. The idea that our brains are constantly trying to predict what's going on in the world, that when I look around, it's not just that I see the bookshelf next to me or the computer screen in front of me. It's that I already know there's a bookshelf next to me and a computer screen in front of me. And all I'm doing with my eyes is kind of checking that my predictions are still correct and updating them if my computer screen has turned off by accident or whatever. Then I was like, okay, I need to update my mental model of the world. So our brains are prediction machines trying to predict what's going on in the world. And the reason we want to predict what's going on in the world is that's the best way to stay alive, is to know what's outside of our heads and what's going to happen so we can do whatever we need to do to stay alive. This is getting a little abstract, so I apologize for that. But the fundamental principle here, what's called the free energy principle, is this idea that we don't want to be surprised. Because if we're surprised, maybe it's going to be a surprise that's going to, eat us or whatever, or boil us or do whatever. So we're trying to minimize surprise. Now, the problem with that, from the perspective of the we're wired to explore picture, is that, well, if you want things to be predictable, this suggests you should just head into your closet, turn out the light, lock the door, and now the world has become perfectly predictable. You know what's going to happen next, which is nothing at all. And this is called, so about 15 years ago, this problem was identified in the philosophy and the neuroscience of worlds, and it was called the dark room problem. It's like, well, okay, hold on. We just came up with this great theory, and the theory suggests all we want to do is lock ourselves in the closet, and that's clearly not true. So the revised view of that is that we want predictability, not just in the present moment, but extending into the future too. We don't want to know what's happening. We want to know what's going to happen. And if you want to know what's going to happen, you need to learn about the world. You need to understand how the world works. So it ends up saying, if you really don't want to be surprised, you need to get out of that closet and you need to go find out what's in the room down the hallway. So you make sure there's not a tiger behind the next door or whatever. Sorry, my metaphors are getting a little odd here, but ultimately what it ends up saying is that we're drawn to explore the unknown, not because we like uncertainty or because we like not know what's going on, but because we really want to know what's going to happen. And by being drawn to open every door, to follow every path, we learn more about the world. We get a better model of the world so we can predict what's going to happen well in advance. And so that's the kind of deeper reason that says organisms that are drawn to find out about the world learn more about the world. They're more successful. They pass, and then through evolution, they end up passing on their genes. And so we end up as humans with this very complicated wiring in our brains where dopamine hits reward prediction errors that ultimately fulfills this this imperative that we want to be exploring the world so that we can learn about it.
Yeah. So we have this pull. I think most of us probably understand this, and yet we also have things like a freeze response as well. What did you find about aversion to exploration?
Yeah, there's definitely a push and a pull. And there's a very well studied phenomenon called ambiguity aversion, which is that we really hate situations where we don't have enough information to make a choice, where there's conflicting information, and it's like, oh, it's cloudy, but the barometer is dropping, so I don't know if it's going to rain. Should I bring an umbrella? And so we're pulled in both directions, and I think the draw to explore is a draw to learn about the world for the future, which is one draw. The draw to avoid uncertainty, to in a sense to lock ourselves in the closet, is a draw for present safety and comfort. And so, in a sense, you could maybe think of it as a trade-off between the present and the future. So we're torn between, I just want to be happy right now, versus I need to do what's going to be best for me in the coming hours, days, months, weeks, years. And that trade-off is real, and it's important too, because when I started working on this book, I maybe imagined that subtitle was going to be "Why Exploring is the Best Thing Ever," and why we should always explore more. And I pretty quickly realized exploring is really important and really valuable and really essential to us. It's also the kind of thing that leads people to if we're talking about early explorers, to die, to sail off the edge of the earth, figuratively speaking, or in the context of modern life, to be continually unhappy, to never settle, never be happy with where you are, always launching off to try something else. So you don't want to have an unfettered drive to explore that just always draws you on. Neither do you want to have only a drive to kind of nest and stay where you are and never explore what's around you. You need to have both pulling on you, and be able to kind of, hopefully contextually make good decisions that right now I should be following this pull to explore, but maybe tomorrow I should be following the pull to just kind of be where I am, stay in a predictable context rather than, always going one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. And you use the phrase ambiguity aversion. This reminds me of something that's come up a lot in my recent interviews, which is the idea of cognitive dissonance, that can be a very tiresome thing for people to not quite know. They're trying to hold two ideas in their head. Maybe there's someone in your life who you think, maybe this is my best friend, but maybe this person is trying to get the best of me and something's not right here. And that wears people down. How does that compare with the ambiguity aversion? Are we on a similar track?
Yeah, I mean, the cognitive dissonance is really interesting because it's very tiring to try and our instinct is always to find a way to resolve that that dissonance, to make it all seem like part of one story. So, for example, exploring is hard, right? And in some contexts, it's uncertain. There's the possibility of failure, and that ties into a broader kind of idea that we often do hard things voluntarily and like it. So let's, like running marathons and climbing mountains and eating spicy foods. And it's actually a bit of a riddle. So psychologists call it the effort paradox. Why is it that we actually are attracted to doing things that are, by definition hard? Like that, the whole point of them is they're hard. And, one cognitive dissonance is one of the explanations that they invoke, which is that, like, if you're doing this hard thing, let's say you're running a marathon, and it's really hard and it gets really miserable, and you ask yourself, why am I doing this? You have cognitive dissonance there between, like, I hate this, but I'm doing it. And so you resolve it by deciding, I guess I really like this. I guess this is really important to me. And so you end up liking it in order to resolve the cognitive dissonance between the fact that you're doing something that you don't like, but that you're clearly doing it. So anyway, that's a bit of a digression from what you're talking about. But I think the point is, our tendency is to try and get rid of that sort of cognitive dissonance. And ambiguity aversion is absolutely, when you have two conflicting sources of information, for example, that's really hard for us to deal with. We hate that, and so you can set up like betting games or lab games where people are exposed to ambiguous information, or they can take another option that's demonstrably worse, and people will take the demonstrably worse option in order just to have like, oh, I'd rather get 5 cents than not knowing whether I'm going to get 10 cents or 20 cents. And it's like, but yeah, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it's like, and you're like, but that's clearly irrational. You should just tolerate the ambiguity because it's going to be a better option. And people are like, no, I really just want to get rid of the, and then they do studies and it's like, okay, we're going to explain to you what ambiguity aversion is. We're going to explain what it is. We're going to help you. And then you're going to be able to make better choices. And people's choices get a little bit better, but you can't eliminate the ambiguity aversion. Even knowing about it, we still just find it uncomfortable to have conflicting ideas or conflicting sources of information. And so we'll, in effect, be willing to pay to get out of that state.
So if we know that exploration is so important, then what makes us stay put? There is this ambiguity thing. Are there other big factors?
Yeah, I mean, look, one answer is that sometimes staying put is the best choice. It's the best bet, right? Yeah. Like, but another thing to consider is that we're often trading off between the present and the future. And so let me give an example here. So this is going to be a long answer.
Okay.
Let me introduce terminology. The explore-exploit dilemma. It's this sort of, it's just the words researchers use to explain this sort of very familiar choice of, do you stick with what you know? Do you exploit your current knowledge, or do you explore new knowledge? And the classic example is ordering in a restaurant. You've been to a restaurant, this restaurant before. Do you order what you had last time, which was pretty good? And whatever, let's say you always order the burger or whatever, or do you try something new? Do you try the special, which might be better, but might be worse? And so, and this is a very common example, that illustrates the type of choices we face with career choices, with relationship choices, with corporate strategy choices. But the restaurant example is the classic example. And you can actually, in this modern world, we have like food delivery companies with massive data sets that tell us about the way we order food and the patterns we fall into. And so there was a big study of some 1.6 million orders or something from a company called Deliveroo, which is kind of like Uber Eats, mainly in the UK and Europe, I think. And there's a lot of interesting insights in this data. One is that all else being equal, we tend to prefer to order from restaurants that we know less about. So this idea of we're drawn to explore. That was the main finding from that study. But there's another interesting one, which is that if let's say you're ordering food, and you order food frequently, so there's a bunch of restaurants that you usually order from. But let's say you decide to try a new restaurant. On average, you will get a worse meal based on your rating. Like, so when people order from a new restaurant, they're like, on average, they're calling it a 4.1 or something, whereas when they order from one of their old standbys, they average 4.3 or whatever. So you're taking a hit from exploring. Now, in the long run, if you continue exploring, you'll get some good meals, you'll get some bad meals. When you get a bad meal, you never order from that restaurant again. When you get a good meal or a great meal, you add that to your rotation. And so over time, your group of restaurants that you order from gets better and better. And so the payoff from exploration is that over time you get better meals. But the fact remains that every time you choose to explore, on average, you will get a worse meal than if you stuck with one of your favorites. So this is this present versus future thing. Why do we want to just stay put sometimes? Or in this example, why do we want to just order from the old favorite? It's a more in a single shot, like right now, how good is my meal going to be? You should not explore. It's just that only when you zoom out and say, where will I be in a year? It's like, I better keep exploring. So I think you can generalize that to like, yeah, in the short term, often just like sticking with what we know is the smart choice. It's just the problem is if you always do that, you lose your chance to grow and to find new horizons.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder about something that it connects to both of your books, I think, and that's the perceived effort of exploring. You talked a lot in Endure about perceived effort as well. And then if you have mental fatigue, something like cognitive dissonance, everything begins to feel harder. So what can we do to affect our perceived effort?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we tend to imagine that the effort involved in a decision or a choice or a path or a route is some kind of objective fact, right? Like it is 7.3 out of 10 hard to do this. And that's because of the lactate in my bones or, my core temperature or my breathing. And the truth is that almost everything we do is dictated not by the sort of physiological fact of how hard something is, but by the perception, by our subjective perception of how hard this is. And so, in the context of what we were just talking about, like the explore-exploit dilemma or trade-off, one way to think about that is to zoom out temporally, or just so to get out of your own head, because it's your head that's telling you how hard this is. So you're thinking this is going to be hard. So one way to zoom out is to say, if I had a friend in this situation, what would I advise them? So make it less personal, get some psychological distance. What would I tell a friend who is sitting in the restaurant and deciding whether to order a burger for the 11th time this month or to try something different? Or to zoom out temporally and say, when I'm looking back on this moment 6 months from now, will I be more likely to say, boy, I'm glad I got the burger again? Or will I be more likely to say, I'm glad I was willing to explore that, even though it was difficult. So it's a way of reconceptualizing what's actually involved, to take it to, in other words, to try and break the tyranny of the perceived effort. So you're not just thinking about how hard it is. Now, I mean, perceived effort is a whole rabbit hole we can go down, obviously, because it is based on physiological realities. Like we tend to think things are hard because they're hard, but it's also affected by what's going on in our minds. And so I think the one message I would say is useful to keep in mind is that one of the big factors in perceived effort is what your internal monologue is saying. If you're telling yourself, this is really hard, this is really stupid, why did I sign up for this? I always fail when I try this. Not only is that unpleasant, but it literally makes whatever you're doing feel more difficult. And so if you're able to reframe the inner monologue, to find other ways of talking about it, you can't just say, like, again, I'll give an example from like running. If you're in the middle of a marathon, you can't just say, oh, well, I'm the best in the world, I'm going to set a world record, so I'm just going to start sprinting and it's going to be easy. It doesn't work that way. Like your subconscious is not stupid. So you have to be able to say things that are reasonable, that not that this is suddenly easy, but that, yeah, this is hard, but this is what I prepared for. Everyone around me is feeling the same thing. This is what I signed up for. There's nowhere I'd rather be. And so it's going to be hard, but I'm ready for it. It is much more productive than, why did I sign up for this stupid thing? Why, I hate this. I'm such an idiot. I should just drop out. I wonder where the subway, nearest subway stop is. So I think that's generalizable to, if you're trying to psych yourself up to take an exploratory decision, whether that's, career-wise or relationship-wise or whatever the case, you need to think about how you're talking about it to yourself and how you frame it, acknowledging the real difficulties that may be ahead, but also focusing on what makes you ready to handle them.
Alex, this is reminding me of things twofold that have come up in a lot of my interviews now, and I hadn't made this connection before. So a lot of people who I talk to or who listen to the show have had experience with psychopaths being abused by these people, and it can make for sort of a chronic freeze response. These people don't want to leave the house when they realize what they've been through, or sometimes even if they haven't even realized it. Now, you talked about that voice, and we've talked about the cognitive dissonance. So if you have the cognitive dissonance from a relationship with this person, you probably also have their voice in your head. That part of the manipulation that they put you through is to really break you down in your confidence. So people have to overcome both of these things, their own mental fatigue, and they have to overcome that negative voice. And something that's come up again and again is trying to think like, what would a friend tell you about X, with all sorts of things that people deal with. But in this situation, I think just something like getting out of the house to get that voice of a friend going it's so simple, and yet it sounds like it's so important for people. I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and it's so I'll say from my perspective, like in sports psychology as a former athlete,
yeah.
It's like I got all this advice about, negative thought stopping when I was in college. We had a sports psychologist who was trying to teach us like the 5 R's of negative thought stopping: recognize, relax, refuse, reframe, resume. I remember it, but I didn't apply it because it didn't seem real to me. It just seemed kind of like mumbo jumbo. And so it's taken me a long time to come around to the idea that, like the words in our heads really do have power. And even though you can't like measure them and put them in a teaspoon and photograph them, you need to take them seriously. And so, and if you have someone else's voice in your head telling you what you can and can't do, that's a problem. And it's hard. It's kind of like the don't think of a white bear thing. You can't just tell someone, don't think about that voice that you're thinking about. And so I think, and look, I'm not a psychologist or anything, so like, don't, this is not medical advice, but it's like, I think the more practical approach is trying to replace, well, first of all, like you said, change the context, go get outside, change the environment, but also think about positive things you can say to yourself to crowd out the other voice, as opposed to just saying go away voice. You need to replace it with something of your own. In the context of like sports psychology and self-talk, like no one ever says you can expect to get immediately to all positive talk, because it's hard. Those voices are persistent. But yeah, just to be able to say, I hear you, but shut up. I guess the other thing I would say on that, the advice I've heard is, and I don't know to what extent this is relevant or transferable, but yeah, that you can't always expect to have nothing but happy talk in your head. And so you can sort of, the voice says it, and whether you say shut up or whether you just say, okay, you're like, whatever. And then you move on to, just because unwanted thoughts occur in your head doesn't mean you have to listen to them or give them space. But I guess what I'm saying here is aspiring to perfection is difficult, because then if unwanted thoughts intrude, you think, oh, darn it didn't work. And you say, no, it's still fine. The thought intruded, you let it pass, and then you resume on your way.
If we're talking about working down this behavior, this barrier rather, of perceived effort, a couple of things that came up in our conversation years ago: smiling faces, and oddly enough, bad deeds can be motivating. There's this great revenge story in your book as well. So I wonder for people too, would you recommend trying to get around smiling people or comedy, things like that? Does that work? And I want to talk about revenge too.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some really interesting sports psych research into this idea of smiling, and it comes from this is one of those classic examples where science followed the real world. So there's a marathoner, Eliud Kipchoge, who was the greatest marathoner in the world for about a decade, who would have this big smile on his face for large parts of the race, and it's sort of like you couldn't tell, is he just grimacing? Is that really a smile? Or is it just natural? And eventually he explained, no, he's deliberately smiling because he found that when he's smiling, just everything seems better. It's sort of his mind telling the rest of his body how to feel. And so scientists tested it, and they're like, oh yeah, it does make running easier if you put a smile on your face. And it's something that I've definitely then experimented with. And I would say my personal experience has been I can't run with a big smile on my face. It doesn't work. But what I've noticed is if I get the grimace off my face, so instead of that, when I'm running hard, I tend to have this performative look of effort on my face, as if I'm trying to show everyone just how hard I'm trying. And even if I can just relax my face, forget about smiling, but just move into a relaxed, that the facial expression does, that I can feel, my whole effort feels noticeably lower than when I'm grimacing. And I think that kind of follows from a broader principle. I think Rich Roll is the guy who popularized the phrase "mood follows action," or may come from somewhere else, but it's like you can't wait or it's not necessarily ideal to wait until you feel great to go do something. Sometimes you just have to go do what you know you should do, and it will start feeling good later. Like if you're like, I'm not sure I want to go running on this cold winter's day. Let's wait until I'm feeling more motivated. It's like, no, just get out the door, go. And chances are within 5 minutes, you'll be in the routine and if in the rhythm. And if not, you can turn around and come home, but do the things you know you should do. And then your mood will follow that. And I think that's pretty valuable advice.
Definitely. Yeah. And the revenge thing too is interesting because, when people get away from a psychopath and they realize what's going on, a lot of people harbor revenge fantasies. And I've had doctors on the show who've talked about this, and at least one of them has said that's natural. You kind of let it run. The people who get targeted are often highly conscientious, highly agreeable people. And so there's guilt and confusion around this. But one thing I find interesting is that in your work, you found that revenge ideas, revenge fantasies can be inspiring to action, yes?
Yeah. So there's this, sometimes you read studies and you're like, oh, that's not, like, in a perfect world, I wish that's not what the study found. Right. So I can't remember the exact details of the study, but it was like, test your strength, then, imagine yourself doing a good deed and then test your strength. And then it's like, imagine yourself doing a bad deed and test your strength. And it's like, yeah, imagining doing the good deed, like, I can't remember, it was donating to a charity or something. It's like, it kind of enhanced their strength because it could have maybe improved their self-efficacy or their feeling of that they're capable people in the world. But they got a bigger boost from imagining doing a negative act. So, look, these are deep waters. But I think what it speaks to is that tapping into your emotions is a way of overcoming barriers of that you're putting on yourself of effort to if it's something you care about, whether it's positive or negative, that can be a fuel to help you achieve goals you set for yourself. What those goals are is maybe another question, but
yeah, I believe that a lot of athletes know this intuitively. If you watch a movie like Star Wars and you think like, I can see the dark side energy being appealing to someone who's got great ambition, and you know that there's something there that would be energizing should you go for it. But it's, as you said, it's tapping into emotions in general, and there can be that light side too.
Yeah, there was a really interesting study maybe a decade ago of elite British athletes looking at Olympic athletes and comparing those who were really, really, really good, like Olympic finalists, with those who actually were like world champions or, making the podium, winning the Olympics. And there's a lot in this study. It was a sort of psychological profile of their lives and trying to, not a huge data set because there aren't that many Olympic athletes out there. But one of the findings, the one that got a lot of attention, is that if you're trying to understand the difference between, the person who comes first and the person who comes fourth or fifth or seventh or whatever, a common finding was that the people who won tended to have some trauma in their lives, usually, in their teen years, around the time when they took up whatever sport. So there was an association that the sport they were transferring some challenges in their lives into sport, which then fueled them. So both cohorts, the fifth placers and the first placers, they're very talented athletes, very physically gifted, very motivated, have spent their lives pursuing it. But there was an extra edge for the people who had, and the trauma, it's not like necessarily, their house blew up or anything. We're talking trauma with a small t, things that were challenging in their lives, whether it was, a divorce or a difficult relationship or something like that. Or a parent passing away. There are a lot of different things it could be, or even just like maybe a negative social experience or whatever. But there's the sense, and this experience helped give that extra edge. And it goes back to this idea of explore versus exploit, or like when is enough enough? And maybe in some sense, for the people who make it to the very top, they have this feeling that they're still, they're really working through something and it's never quite enough, that they always want to do a little bit more. And I would say that that's not necessarily a blessing. Those results really made me think carefully. It's like, well, would you make that trade? Like, if, adding some trauma to my life would make me a little bit faster, a little bit more insatiable rather, in terms of always wanting more. It's like, you got to be careful what you wish for, I guess is what I'm saying. But to bring it back to the question you asked, I think this is another example of maybe challenging or channeling emotion and using it as fuel to push yourself towards goals that you've identified as valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, identifying as valuable. It sounds like we're talking about imbuing an activity with meaning. Would you say something like that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that's a very hard thing to define, but in its nebulous way, that's what we're all looking for, right? Mm-hmm. Is the feeling that what we're doing has a point and is worthwhile.
Yeah. So if we're trying to do that, it could be something as simple as, if you are a person who's been through a lot, getting out, returning to normal life, what could we do to put meaning into that could help us to access those emotions and maybe overcome those initial barriers to action?
Yeah, so we're getting into even deeper waters here, because I'm not a philosopher or psychologist, but there's one strand of research in the exploring literature that I thought was really meaningful, and
yes,
this work about meaning was meaningful. So I'm talking in circles now, and it goes back to what I was talking about before about the effort paradox and the idea that we sometimes do things that are challenging in part because they're challenging. We take on challenges because we want to be challenged. We want to be stretched. We want to find out what we're capable of. And so I mentioned before that it's a bit of a riddle why we do this. And there's lots of different theories, including that we want to resolve cognitive dissonance. But the theory that I actually, or the line of research that I find most interesting, it relates to meaning. So there's a researcher named Michael Inslicht at the University of Toronto who has studied the effort paradox a lot. And so what he has found is that one of the reasons people tend to do hard things like run marathons or whatever is that they find the things that are hard are things that people tend to find meaningful, whether that's climbing a mountain, finishing a marathon, bringing up children, whatever the case. These things are very hard, but they also tend to score very highly on a sense of meaning. And to the extent that people are able to find meaning in doing challenging things, the people who find doing hard things meaningful also tend to end up with a lot of positive outcomes. They tend to report that their lives have more meaning and they are happier and they're more successful at work. And so, I mean, this is convenient, right? Like if you find that working hard gives you a sense of meaning, then you're likely to work hard and as a result to do well in your life, but more importantly to be satisfied, to feel like what you're doing is meaningful. And so from the exploring perspective, I think this is like, again, when we're weighing this, like, oh, should I stick with what I've got or should I try something new? You can look at it from a utilitarian point of view. You can say, well, you should try different things in restaurants because someday you'll be glad you discovered that you really like, ceviche or whatever. But there's another way of looking at it, not the utilitarian perspective of like you explore because you'll get good things, but the other way of looking at it is explore because it'll make you feel good. It'll be fun. It'll be rewarding. It'll be meaningful. And so for people who are coming out of, challenging situations and looking to get their lives kind of back on track, to take ownership again of feeling like they're in control, I think that's actually a pretty good, a better motivation than like, if you're willing to explore, you will get good things. It's more like, this is a way of reclaiming the idea that you're engaged in meaningful tasks, that you're doing something that's hard and it's going to feel worthwhile. And whether that hard thing is simply like reclaiming your life and reclaiming, getting back out into society and learning, trusting people again, or whether it's undertaking a specific, like, I'm going to get out there and I'm going to date, or I'm going to climb a mountain, or I'm going to take a chance in my career, that taking on something that scares you a little bit, that is going to be challenging, that carries the risk of failure, is ultimately going to be more rewarding in a personal sense than playing it completely safe, which again is, in the short term, might seem like the safe move, but in the long term is maybe passing up opportunities to pursue meaning.
Mm-hmm. So you got to get that voice of a friend going in yourself, remind you of this potential for meaning, and run with that.
Yeah, because look, we all have powerful voices telling us to just take the easy route, to again, all my examples are from running because it's the great analogy for everything in my life. But it's like, I've been running for 30 years or more than that. And it's like, I wake up on a cold morning. Of course, there's a voice in my head that says, why would you run today? Like, stay inside. Don't, just relax. You don't need to run today. That voice is never going to go away. Like, there's always going to be doubt. And so it's a question of finding ways of circumventing that voice, of saying, well, yeah, like you said, well, will I be glad, a month from now, will I be glad that I ran today, or will I be or would I be more glad that I just, stayed in bed? Or what would I tell my friend if they called and said, yeah, it looks kind of cold. Do you think we should run? And in fact, that, like, that's the greatest reason of all for running with friends, because then it's like, you don't have to imagine what you would say to your friend. You're like, well, I agreed to meet my friend. Is my friend going to show up? Yes. So I'm going to show up. And meanwhile, the friend is like, I don't want to go, but I agreed to meet, Alex, so I'll go. And so you create accountability for each other by being the exterior voice, the voice outside the head.
Yeah. And is this also related to the IKEA effect a little bit too? This idea that, if there's a certain amount of ownership and that comes with effort?
Yeah. So the IKEA effect is basically another example of the effort paradox. And so this is a study researchers did where they found that if you get the furniture from IKEA and figure out the pictographic instructions and so on and assemble the coffee table, you will value it more highly than if you got the identical coffee table pre-assembled. That there's something about having to struggle with it that gives it more value. So then, if you're asked to sell it, how much would you ask for it? You'll ask for more if you put it together yourself, because you feel ownership of it. You feel a connection to it because you put something of yourself into figuring it out. So, I do think that's super generalizable, that the things you get out and accomplish on your own, through your own effort, have way more meaning than just having everything, having this, something given to you, on a platter.
And this gets to something else that you've written about too, which is passive and active exploration. What's that?
Yeah. So this was my way of grappling with the sort of hypothetical question of, like, what's the difference between climbing Mount Everest or being guided up Mount Everest by an expert team that sort of cuts the steps for you and carries your bag and gives you the oxygen and tells you exactly what to do, versus at the other extreme, like watching a National Geographic documentary about climbing Mount Everest? Like, what are these forms of exploring? And are there differences between them? Is there a better and a worse? And in some sense, like, if you think about how I've tried to explain exploring, or at least the utilitarian version of how I've tried to explain exploring, which is that we want to know how the world works. The truth is, you probably learn more about Mount Everest watching the National Geographic documentary than you do climbing it, right? You're gonna know a lot more facts rather than just sort of slogging up the mountain. And so why is that better? Then should we all just focus on watching, documentaries? And look, intuitively, I don't think so. And so why not? And the comparison I would make is to, let's say you're driving in a car through an unfamiliar city, trying to find a hotel, let's say. If you're in the driver's seat when you get there, then you're going to have a much easier time retracing your steps than if you were just sitting in the passenger seat chatting away. And you've seen exactly the same stuff. You're both sitting in front of the same windshield. But when you're driving, you have to pay attention to the world. You have to make decisions. You have to be like, oh, here's the traffic light. Is this the street I'm supposed to turn left on? I think it must be because it's running parallel to the river. So anyway, you're being forced to internalize a bunch of information, to map it in your hippocampus. Whereas if you're in the driver's seat, you're seeing all this stuff, but you're not. I've been rereading all the Sherlock Holmes lately. So as Sherlock Holmes would say, you're seeing, Watson, but you're not observing. You're seeing the same stuff, but you're not observing. So that's actually an interesting point. The reason I'm rereading Sherlock Holmes is that I'm giving a talk to the Arthur Conan Doyle Society in Toronto in a few months. And so I'm looking for connections between exploring it. Anyway, I'll jot that down in my scratch pad. But so the point is, you don't learn the same things seeing as you do observing. In the National Geographic documentary, a ton more information is sort of aimed at your eyeballs and your ears, but you're going to retain much less of it. We all understand this difference between like being in the driver's seat and being in the passenger seat of a car. And so it's not that I don't like National Geographic documentaries. They're awesome. But the general thing I would say is the trend in society these days is towards more and more passive forms of exploration. And you can say the social media algorithms, like, they're designed to tickle our exploring circuitry. We're always being surprised by what video is next when we scroll down. But we're not making any choices, really. We're just it's like being in the passenger of a car, and they're just sort of flashing scenery past us in an attempt to amuse us. We're not following our own curiosity. We're not making decisions that have consequences. So we can just sort of sit there with drool, running down our cheek, being amused without learning anything, you can get into the neuroscience of it. There's old studies going back as far as the 60s where it's like with cats and stuff, where one cat gets to choose what is seen and the other cat sees exactly the same stuff. So you get the same information, but it's encoded in the brain totally differently when you're choosing to see it, when it's your curiosity that's driving the bus. And so, yeah, I won't ramble on other than to say, I think an important principle to keep in mind these days is to try and do things that are interesting to you rather than just letting the world come to you and inject itself into your brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you've spoken about this too, that there's even potentially a relationship between, things like driving and navigating on your own and structures in your brain and perhaps even long-term health, things like Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I will say, these days I try not to use the turn-by-turn directions in my car. Not because they're like lethal poison or anything like that, but just because it has become easy to become totally passive. And so, my habit got to the point where it's like, I drive my kids to soccer practice like 50 times a week or something like that, it seems. I don't need the GPS to get there, but I turn it on when I get in the car, and then I just drive, and partly that's because, maybe the traffic patterns are different or whatever. But it's like, no, I really should focus. I can figure out where I'm going. And so there is this body of evidence, which is, let's be clear, it's not a perfect body of evidence. It's somewhat speculative, but there's evidence that when you navigate by sort of spatially learning, mapping your way through a territory, you use a region of the brain called the hippocampus. when you navigate just by sort of going from point A to point B to point C, saying, okay, I'll go until the GPS says turn left, or I'll go until the gas station and turn left there, or whatever. That's what's called stimulus response navigation. You use a different part of your brain called the caudate nucleus. And we can both do both forms of navigation, but we tend to default to one or the other. And especially as we get older, we tend to move towards stimulus response navigation and away from hippocampus, cognitive mapping, it's called. And whichever region of the brain or whichever type of navigation you use more, you can see differences in the size of the brain. If you tend to use cognitive mapping, your hippocampus will be bigger. If you tend to use stimulus response navigation, as you would with GPS, your caudate nucleus tends to be bigger. And these changes can happen relatively quickly. Like there've been studies with asking people to come in and play video games that are biased to make people use one or the other form of navigation. And after a few months, you can see slight changes in the size of these brain structures. There's a separate body of evidence that finds that having a smaller hippocampus is a risk factor for conditions like Alzheimer's, PTSD, trying to remember what the other ones are, but if depression, anxiety. It seems like a stretch to me to say that if I use turn-by-turn directions in my car, I'm going to get Alzheimer's. Like these are multifactorial complex diseases. But I find the circumstantial evidence that it might raise my risk a little bit enough that I'm making a deliberate effort to find my way around, to learn when I travel, to like, you know what, I'm going to take a look at the map. I'm going to figure out where I need to go. And then I'm going to try and find my way there rather than just sort of walk from street to street following my phone. And I'll tell you, I was in Paris a few weeks ago and I tried to do that and I got hopelessly lost every time I did because it's a very confusing city. And so I'd end up like 6 blocks north of my hotel thinking I was, 2 blocks south. I'm like, what the hell happened? No big deal. I had my phone with me. I could regroup and find my way home, back to the hotel again. So it's not that it's easy, but it's like, yeah, that there may be consequences. It's use it or lose it, and we're in a world where you can really never have to know where you are anymore, and that's a little scary.
Yeah. You've inspired me. Now I silence my GPS and I turn it away and try to remember where I'm going, and then if I do get stuck, then I can just pull it right out and have it ready. Like a map.
Yeah, and there's a very good case to be made that having the phone available frees us up to be more exploratory.
There you go.
Like in the olden days, in the paper map days, which I'm old enough to remember, it's like you had to be pretty damn careful where you went. And you're in a strange city and all you have is one piece of paper. It's like if you got lost, you're screwed. It's a problem. Whereas now, we are much more free to explore if we use it like you're describing, if we use it as a backstop rather than as a sort of IV drip directly into our brain.
Yeah. We're talking a little bit, I think, too, about the confidence to explore. Do you think that there's a way that we can kind of understand our own abilities to explore and to work from there?
Like, I think confidence, so first, to the broader point of confidence, I think that's a huge factor. And I think, when I do talk to people who are like, oh, I'm not much of an explorer, what they're saying is not that they're not interested in new things. What they're saying is that in some contexts, they lack the confidence. They don't think they're capable of taking those risks. And so, I think that's, it's important or useful to try and understand where that's coming from and what is it you're worried about. So like in the geographical sense, are you worried about getting lost? Because now that you have your phone in your pocket, you don't need to be worried about getting lost. Like there's, okay, it's not that there's zero dangers, you might end up in a bad part of town or something like that. But you can, if you think carefully about what it is that's holding you back, what are you worried about happening? I think that's helpful. And so, like, I will say, I'm in general quite an anxious person, and I'm well known among my friends and family as like the enumerator of all the negative things that could happen if we make this choice. If we do this, this might happen, and that might happen, and that might happen, and that might happen. And my wife is much more bold and confident about making these sorts of choices, and she's been good about helping me of like think through like, okay, you don't want to do this thing because this bad thing might happen. Okay, so if that happens, then what will happen? Like, what are the actual consequences? And you sort of follow it through, and it's like, well, then I'll feel bad. It's like, okay, that's not so bad. Like, if the bad consequences was, then we'll have to amputate my leg. Then it's like, okay, let's not do that because that really is a bad consequence. But if the bad consequences, I'll feel a little uncomfortable, I'll be nervous, no big deal. So I think maybe a starting point is try and understand if you're feeling like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get, what are the consequences that you're afraid of? And how bad are they really?
I imagine recovery comes up quite a bit. Recovery after, say, a long season for an athlete, recovery after a period of mental exhaustion, things like that. What do you recommend for people who are recovering from something that's just sort of worn them down like that?
Yeah, recovery is a huge and underappreciated thing. And, in the athletic world, people always tend to think it's like, when will my muscles be better? When will when will I have restocked my, when will I be rehydrated? And the mental aspects of recovery, I think, are really underappreciated. And there's a phenomenon in endurance sports called overtraining syndrome, where it's like the objective reasons for your fatigue are long gone. There's no reason you should still be tired, but you're still fried. And that's really a chronic stress response, right? Like if you've been you haven't been able to turn off the fight or flight settings for days or weeks or months or years, then that leaves an effect. And I think, so I guess what I would say for this context, people who are, maybe coming out of, abusive relationships or whatever the situation is recognizing the reality of the recovery that's required, that you can't just expect yourself to sort of snap back in no time at all. And for everyone, that path is going to be different. So, some people are going to be able to move on more quickly than others. So I think, avoiding the judgment, the negative judgment is important. I know that, like, if in an athletic context, it can be really challenging when an athlete is, when the coach and everyone else thinks you should be back to normal by now. Like what, and so it can feel like people think the athlete is kind of malingering, and it's like, no, there's real damage that's gone on there. I don't know what the magic answer to that is, but I guess the other principle of recovery, I think, that we can maybe extend from the sports world, in the context, let's say you have an acute injury, let's say you sprain an ankle or something like that. For a long time, the dominant paradigm was protect that ankle. Do not use it to, elevate it, swathe it. Don't, until it's all better. Yeah. And the problem is then you 3 weeks later, you start walking on it and you've lost like 20% or 50% of your strength. You no longer have good balance. And it turns out that in the long term, that recovery is going to be worse. And so the paradigm for those sorts of injuries now is early mobilization, early use, but in a very restricted. So it's like, you need to move that ankle, not put your weight on it, but move it. And then a few days later, you need to start walking, but not very much. So it's a question of not retreating within a cocoon and just protecting the injury. You got to use it, but you have to then be sensitive to okay, that's as much as it can take for today. And, if it didn't make it worse tomorrow, then you didn't do too much. And if it did make it worse tomorrow, then you need to be a little bit more cautious. I don't want to over extend the analogy to emotional recovery, but I think there's a similar principle that actually makes a lot of sense to me, which is that you don't want to, recovery doesn't mean retreating to within a cocoon and not doing anything. It just means respecting your limits as you gradually increase them.
Yeah. It sounds like we're getting at what seems to make sense, that, that you want to understand yourself, recognize your own recovery needs. And then also the things that we talked about before, trying to find things that give you a little edge to get out, to have motivation, things like that. Have you ever heard of a technique called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing?
Yeah, I came across it. There's a book by Eva Holland about fear, and I think she had a chapter on that. It's a really good book.
Yeah, it's making me think of your work too. It's you talk about like active and passive exploration, and this is sort of an active process of exploring memories and maybe even writing over them. The theory is that it's like the way we do with dreams, because you're moving your eyes much like you would during REM sleep, and then you're trying to write over a memory, a traumatic experience, something like that. And it strikes me as interesting that there seems to be a parallel here in that active exploration of a situation and what you're talking about. Well, Alex, before I get to my last topic, where should people look for you online?
Probably the easiest place is my website is alexhutchinson.net. I am on various social media platforms, constantly trying to figure out which ones actually work. It's a strange world out there these days, but there's links to all of that and to my recent articles from there.
Okay, great. We'll put links there in the description for everybody to check out. And my final topic, Alex, is really you. We've talked a little bit about some changes you've made with GPS and things like that. What other changes have you made in this exploration study of exploration?
Probably the most, I don't know if this is on brand or off brand. I went on this 5-year kind of digression because I had spent 10 or 15 years before that really getting narrower and narrower on the science of endurance. And then I felt it's too narrow. I need to try something different and explore. And that's what this new book is about. Where I find myself now is like, I kind of want to go back and do more science of endurance. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm exploring the possibility of a book with a friend of mine that will be about, it's still kind of vague, but basically about the conscious experience of running, what it is we feel and experience while running, and how that comes together to make it something that people continue to do, despite the fact that, objectively speaking, it seems sort of pointless. So anyway, all of which is to say, writing a book about exploring did not necessarily make me want to do nothing but explore for the rest of my time. That it's actually helped me to feel more comfortable in saying, hey, this place that I arrived, that I always thought this is where I wanted to be, this is what I would want to do. I got there, then I was like, maybe this isn't what I want to do. I'm going to try something different. And I'm like, yeah, no, I think actually that is kind of where I want to be. And I think I'm in a much more comfortable place saying that I'd like, this is a thing I love. And even though I've been doing it for a while, I'd like to keep doing it. I guess the second answer to your question is, I do a lot of like backcountry travel with my family, with some friends of mine. In some cases, some fairly extreme, not in the sense of like I'm not like cliff jumping or anything like that, but extreme, like getting deep into the backcountry, working very hard, in very remote places to get and this is one of the things that got me interested in the topic. Like, why am I so obsessed with like going to the jungles of Papua New Guinea instead of the beaches of Jamaica or whatever? And I still love that. I've got some great trips planned for this summer, but thinking deeply about exploring has helped me get away from this like obsession with trying to pretend that I'm the first to do something. Clearly I'm not exploring anything. I'm not an actual explorer, but like the point is not to be to have the illusion of that I'm like Christopher Columbus. And so I'm or to get from point A to point B. So I've gotten, I think, a lot better at, or I'm working on, let's put it this way, I'm working on enjoying being in those places and seeing things that are new to me and surprising to me. And so one of the ways I'm doing that is I'm actually trying to research destinations a little bit less. I don't necessarily want to see all the photos of where I'm going. No matter where you go, no matter how remote, someone has put up a travel blog about it. But instead of doing that, I want to be surprised when I go around that corner and see the waterfall, instead of saying, oh, here's the waterfall that I saw on the blog. And I also want to be forced to navigate actively, not by GPS. I want to be looking around, trying to figure out, is this the path I'm supposed to go down? Let's see. There's a, there's a glacier over there. There's a river here, as opposed to just looking at my phone and saying, okay, we got to hang right here, kids. Let's keep marching. So there's ways that I'm trying to make exploring, thinking of exploring as something more personal rather than, falling for the mistake of the sort of bucket list type of exploring, saying I've been here and I've been there and made it here. It's like, forget about where I make it to. Let's just enjoy wherever I happen to be.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And Alex, one more thing I've heard you say, that after you write a book and then you start doing interviews like this, you start to really understand what the book was about in the first place. What do you hope that people take away from the Explorer's Gene?
I got an email yesterday from a reader saying that it had helped them, that after reading the book, they'd realized that the extent to which they'd sort of fallen into routines, that they were, they were running along the same route every day, which, to be fair, is something I do too, but that they had decided that there were opportunities to explore, within their home, within their daily life. And that so one of the things they'd started doing is going for runs in different neighborhoods in their city, and having the confidence to, this person was saying that they were a little bit, averse to uncertainty and novelty, but having the confidence to go on unfamiliar routes and discovering new neighborhoods in their city, and that they found that really rewarding. So it's like, I read that email and honestly, it was very touching. And it's like, I couldn't hope for anything more than that, than that. Not that people read the book and decide that they need to go to the North Pole, but that they decide that it's that uncertainty, even though it's daunting, is rewarding to embrace in some contexts, in some time, in some parts of our lives, and overcoming that initial barrier is if the book can help some people do that in some aspects of their lives, I'd be thrilled.
Sounds beautiful. Well, Alex Hutchinson, thank you for being a thoughtful science communicator. It means so much to have people like you, and your approach and everything, and for the books that you write, and for taking this interview with me 6 years later. Maybe we'll do it again in 6 years. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad. I've really enjoyed this conversation.